So when it comes to data integrity, that's what really databases are there for. If you don't have integrity in the data, then why even bother, right? In fact, it could be detriment to a company if the data is not well maintained with good integrity. So just so you're aware of the terms, data integrity usually falls into these two main categories: domain integrity and referential integrity. Fancy words, you find a lot of people like using fancy words, but what they really mean is domain is within a single table, right? Within the table, are there some kind of constraints to make sure the data is valid, right? You don't have garbage in, garbage out, right? So basic thing is each table has a unique identifier. Many, in fact, most database systems will prevent you from creating a table without a primary key. Some of them will allow it, okay? But basically that's on the assumption that you're going to go back later and add a primary key, because without that there's very little integrity on the database as well. Alternate primary columns can be unique, so you might have other columns that are candidate keys for the primary key that are just as unique as the primary key as well. Sometimes you'll have something like for example, think of medical patients, right? OHIP number is an obvious candidate for a primary key in terms of it being unique. It's an important descriptor and so on and so forth, but because of the highly confidential nature that you want to protect, that is not a good candidate for a primary key, right? Because you don't want that. How you see how foreign keys are usually a copy of the primary key stuck in all these other tables. Well, you don't want to have something personal and important as an OHIP number stuck as a foreign key in all these tables all over the system, right? So you would have a surrogate primary key, maybe an auto number or increment type of thing, identity, okay? Maybe just the next integer number. Or it could be a GUID, global unique identifier, those big long 23 character unique, ugly looking thing. Could be anything like that. And so really that OHIP number would be a unique column within the table as an alternate primary key column. You should specify null or not null. Generally speaking, the rule of thumb is you avoid allowing null values unless it's kind of absolutely required, right? You try to avoid nulls, and that increases overall domain integrity. There are times when we have to live with them. There's situations where it's important to allow null. Sometimes we even allow null on a foreign key, so we aren't prevented from creating a child record even if the appropriate parent record isn't created yet, things like that. Or maybe that they just aren't assigned. Think of a situation where you might have, this pops into my mind, laptops, right? That could or be signed out and assigned to a student for a term. Well, when they're sitting on the shelf, not assigned to anybody, the foreign key of who they belong to or are assigned to right now would have to allow a null value, wouldn't it? Right? So there are times when you do let nulls go by, but as much as possible, we avoid them if we can. All right, and then the quality of the data itself. That's where things like our check constraints and rules come into play. Now, you did some work with check constraints last term? Excellent, good, okay? A rule is basically a check constraint where you can define ones and use it in many different tables on many different fields, rather than having to define it in each and every case, okay? It's basically the same idea, though. So those are all examples of good constraints to put on individual tables to maintain that domain integrity. Referential integrity talks about, how things relate to each other, okay? So we talk about foreign keys. So you might not want to allow orphaned records in a child table that don't have an associated parent, right? Although we just talked about an example where, like with my laptops, where you would allow a null value in the foreign key. So those are decisions you make to try and maintain referential integrity. Quite often what we'll look at is, you talked about cascade delete last term, right? That's a way to maintain referential integrity, that you're prevented from deleting a parent record if there are related child records. You don't have those orphan records left behind, right? Things like that. Okay. So column level constraints, right? Part of the column definition and so on and so forth. So things like our not null, even our checks, uniques, those are all column level constraints. Excuse me. You can define the primary key at the column level, right? But then you can't give it a name. So that's why we usually do them at the end, right? At sort of the table level, and we write our create table statement. You were probably shown both approaches, but typically we define all the constraints at the end, even those ones. If a primary key is composite, then you can't use a column level definition for it. You have to do it at the end instead. So that's where you end up doing something like this. So table level constraints come after you've defined the columns. Okay, this is a quick review of all these commands you learned last term, right? So here we're creating an ownership table. We have various fields we're creating: car ID, person ID, owner percentage, right? This was from that car share database that you did last term. You may or may not have done it. I don't know. I wasn't in class with you. It's a common example we do use in term 1. So this is a case where you would have no choice. You'd have to create the primary key because it's a composite, right? You see here car ID, person ID, right? It's a composite key like we saw in our enrollment table in our Ironwood database, where the enrollment is a composite of the student ID and the section ID and so on. So enforcing uniqueness, we have our 2 main choices. You should always, basically I'll say that, you should always have a primary key, and sometimes we'll have additional unique constraints where appropriate as well. Things that should logically, by the business rules, like an OHIP number, always be unique. Okay, not a good candidate for the primary, but we'll also add that unique constraint. Okay. All right. Excuse me. I'm okay. You know what? We're almost done this, so I'll get through it. Somebody will adopt it eventually.